we are launching a 10-week lesson series on the Enneagram. And if you know anything about me, you know I live and breathe the Enneagram. And for me, this has been such a core part of our ministry here at Unity Temple, and I feel very blessed that we have sort of the creative flexibility where we can bring what is normally taught in classes, workshops, and seminars into what is traditionally the Sunday service. Now, because today is the first day, I want to start with a brief overview, just like a couple minutes right now, and then we'll open with some beautiful music and come on back, and then I'll share a lesson. So not so much a sermon, but a lesson on the Enneagram. So I want to start by giving an overview of what this thing is. So the Enneagram, you see a couple Enneagrams up there. The Enneagram is a system of sacred psychology that has been popularized in modern day primarily through spiritual direction, spiritual counseling, psychology, and is even being used now in the workplace for leadership training and development. The primary way that I teach it is from a spiritual perspective. We are finding that when people have awareness of the psychological structure of their own egos, if you know like what the parameters are of your own egoic structure, then it seems like you're going to have a better chance of transcending that and awakening to a larger realization of yourself, of your true self. So the Enneagram for me has been deeply transformative, supported me on the spiritual journey, helped me in all my relationships, my relationship to myself, to the God of my understanding, and definitely to my relationships to all of you, because I didn't used to like you very much. There was a time when, Sartre's quote, "hell is other people," was like my mantra, and really, those of you who know me now, like maybe, I hope, can't even fathom that day. But there was a day when I really believed it was me and the world, and the Enneagram and the world out there. And the Enneagram helped me to bring that world into a sense of love, unity, and harmony. So I'm so excited to bring this forth today, starting with the point 1 on the Enneagram system. I want to open with a story of a preacher who one Sunday morning came before the congregation and said, "Please stand if you know a perfect woman." And he looks around. Nobody stands up. So he pauses for a moment and thinks, "Okay, please stand if you know a perfect man." And then there's a pause. And then there's a rustle, and then in the back corner of the room, an elderly man hobbles up onto his cane and stands up. And the preacher looks over and says, "So now, honestly, are you telling me that you know an absolutely perfect man?" And the man replies, Well, I don't know him personally, but I hear a great deal about him. And he's the first husband of my wife." The artist Salvador Dali said that we don't have to fear perfection because we're not going to get at it anyway, right? Like this fear of, this idea of perfection. So as we engage with the holy idea of holy perfection on the Enneagram today, it seems like a necessary starting point to first ask the question, is it real? Is the idea of perfection, is perfection even a real thing? Or is it instead something more like me over here, filled with flaws, noticing the lack and limitations of the world, striving for an ideal that is over there? Is perfection something that's real or something that is ideal? as you consider that question for yourself personally, what do I really believe? What do I know personally? I invite you to consider that the Enneagram, as well as unity, teaches this foundational teaching, this idea of holy perfection, which is this, that absolutely, at the level of ultimate reality, you and everything is absolutely perfect, whole, infallible, unassailable, that what is, this pure beingness, is absolutely perfect. But if that's true, I know for me, I have to really dig in and ask myself to reconcile my all so human experience, which is this: from birth, it seems, not enough love, not tall enough, the kids are outgrowing me, in height, all these experiences of making mistakes, of erring, of falling short of the mark. And so in the midst of that, I invite you to consider your experiences of what is less than perfect, and to bring that to the forefront of your consciousness as we invite the consideration of this holy idea. So today, in 3 parts, we'll begin by asking the question from an Enneagram perspective: what do we actually mean by this holy idea of holy perfection? And then second, what do we not mean? What's the difference between this idea and what we normally, habitually, from a worldly perspective, think of as perfection, if you will, and perfecting ourselves and perfecting others? And then finally, I invite you to use the Enneagram as a sacred map home to the realization of the isness, of the perfection, not only of the moment, but completely of who and what you are right here and right now. So I'll begin, first slide. The best way I can think of to take this very heady conceptual material and make it a little bit more relatable is through this well-known story. It derives, as far as I know, from the Sufi tradition, and it goes essentially like this. It's about the blind men and the elephant, right? I know a lot of you already know this story. The blind men and the elephant, as the story goes, there's a group of blind men who approach an elephant and are asked, what do you see? What do you perceive? And so the blind men, each of them go to one different location of the elephant, right? One goes over to the tail, touches the tail. One goes over to the legs, to the feet, touches that. One goes over to the body, touches that. One goes over to the trunk, notices the curve of the trunk. Maybe one of them goes over to the ears and feels the ears. And each of them goes back and reports, well, this thing is kind of fuzzy furry, right? Like a tail. This thing is kind of rough and grainy. The skin of the elephant. Oh, this thing is massive and big, the person that touches the middle broadness of the elephant. Or maybe one touches the toenail. It's like, oh, this is smooth. And so this example is often used to describe how we differently perceive God or reality, right? So each of us might feel a different aspect, if you will. And that's a way of describing God. So I'm going to take this and turn it upside down, if you will. So what if, instead of these blind men feeling the section that they're connected to, what if instead each of them had selective sight? Kind of like how my husband has selective hearing, right? They only hear certain things, only see certain things, and don't see other things. So from this framework, you might look and go, oh, well, there are these different aspects of reality. All love, holy perfection, one will, expressing in a diverse way harmoniously, that all of these facets exist, but there are 9 ways, according to the Enneagram, that we have lost sight of one face of it. It's as if that blind man can see everything except the tail, everything except the part that they're most intimately connected with. And then what happens? Next slide. Each of these men are like, holy crap, there is no holy perfection. At point 1, that type, from that perspective, says the perfection of the universe doesn't exist. If you're at point 9 on the Enneagram and you have that orientation, you're saying holy love doesn't exist. It's not universal. It's not for everyone. It's not for me. And so each type has one of these different blind spots, if you will. This is very important. So the idea is that each and every person here has one of those 9 orientations, 9 blind spots. And having that blind spot, we imagine, wow, we are separated from the whole. We're either separated from the perfection of things and therefore are broken. We're separated from love, and therefore, I better merge with others in order to feel my sense of oneness with all people. So each of us is separate from one thing. And then what happens after we experience this blind spot or this delusion is that we develop a personality, that you develop a very rational personality designed to get in the world that which you thought you lost. And so, today, as we go over the type 1, we go over specifically the type that happens to be my personality type. So I take this very personally, if you will. This idea that at some point, I believe that you came into the world with a certain soul orientation. To have lost sight of the perfection of things. Learning about that helped me to understand why, when I wasn't getting love in my childhood as I perceived it, that the reaction that I had was to turn within and say, what's wrong with me? Some people point out there, and I remember going, something must be wrong with me, and if I could figure it out, and if I could fix it, then I would be okay. Then people would love me, and then I would have my needs met. If only I could fix myself. And thus began a lifelong journey until I met the Enneagram, a lifelong journey of self-improvement projects. So I want to go back a step and take the next slide. Here's a glance. When you lose sight of a holy idea, then correspondingly, there's a heart place in which you lose sight also of what's called one of the holy virtues. For the one which loses sight of the holy idea of the innate perfection of things, then the natural reaction is to be pissed off, right? To be angry. And so the one then loses sight of the virtue of serenity. So the two are intimately related because what is isn't working. What is doesn't seem right. That's the blind spot of the type 1. And so next slide. So the idea fundamental to the holy ideas in the Enneagram is that each of us develops a personality type to compensate, as I shared earlier. So what happens? So we build up a structure, an egoic fixation that's called, for the one, resentment. I'm resentful, that the world isn't what I think it should be. And then I'm angry. Sometimes, being angry for a one isn't about blatant anger, but it's sort of an ongoing judgmental state, a righteous anger against how things are. So that's the egoic structure for type 1, and the next slide lays it out. All right. So the result, I'm pissed, anger, and resentment kind of breathe through. It's important to note that even as we focus on the individual place on the Enneagram, the type 1, that of course the illusion of imperfection runs across the entire it runs across humanity, right? That all of us at some point have this idea that what is isn't what should be. And so the type 1 is just the type that takes it the most seriously, if you will. Takes it the most personally. But we all have some element of this. And the idea is, next slide, to awaken. And so based on this notion that reality as a whole actually is perfect, that all the holy ideas are embodied in every moment, which is a core unity teaching. Our goal then is not to fix ourselves or fix the world. You know, a trap that we can fall into in spiritual circles, right? As we charge in that quest for spiritual and personal growth, there's an endeavoring based on what we think is missing. And the idea here that I invite all of us to, in the most profound way, is to remember that in this moment, or to even consider the possibility that in this moment, you are actually whole and perfect. That reality is whole and perfect exactly as it is. And that your work is not to obtain some sort of perfection over there, but merely to wake up to the perfection that is already here in our midst as the essence of all that is. But to do that, we need to begin by looking at the ways we are deluded and go astray. Before we go there, I want to read from the book, The Facets of Unity. An Enneagram teacher named Almas says this. Here's a quote slide. The idea is that holy perfection represents the idea of mirror-like wisdom that is taught in the Buddhist tradition. So in this teaching, the perfection of reality can be seen only if our consciousness, and there's the quote, is like a clear mirror which reflects everything as it is, without prejudice or distortion. When we perceive with this clarity, we recognize that reality has a sense of purity, neatness, immaculateness, and beauty inherent in it. So to see reality from the perspective of holy perfection means to see that reality is right, just as it is, and it doesn't need any changes or corrections. But as you hear that, even as I say that, is there not a part of you that wonders if that is true? Is there not a part of you that's like, well, but what about, the politics? What about healthcare? But what about death? What about loss? What about addiction? What about poverty? What about children suffering? How can it possibly be true that there is a perfection in all things? This is a really radical notion, right? But arguably, both Jesus and Buddha and other wisdom teachers were radical thinkers and leaders. People who basically broke through the paradigm of how we normally orient in the world. So I invite you to consider that maybe if you tend to think, actually, things aren't right, that you might open your mind and heart to the possibility that even that idea comes from illusory thinking born of the idea that you believe that you are separate from God, separate from reality, and separate from life. So, the ways home. The fundamental teaching here is that When I believe that I have separated from reality, which I generally believe because I think I'm a different body from you, that somehow you're separate from me, then the result of that is naturally to have what's called comparing mind, right? As I shared earlier, taller and shorter, hotter and colder, better and worse, wrong and right, black and white, just, unjust. And the world spins endlessly in this kind of dual pattern of the comparing mind. The comparing mind, however, demands that we believe that we're separate from Source, separate from God, and separate from one another, because how else would we have contrast? And so one of the ways that we're invited through the map of the Enneagram to come home is to consider this. In my daily life, when I wake up, am I constantly judging? Am I going, oh, that's too hot, or that's too cold? And if I'm aware of that, what if I were to consider that my judgment is not actually accurate? Again, that's a radical notion. But what if I could just simply question? I don't have to know what's accurate, but simply question, like, oh, bless you. So the other piece is Brené Brown. How many of you have heard of Brené Brown? Yeah, she does some powerful work on the topic of perfection. And there's a quote from her right here. So the issue is a lot of us might think, well, you know, if I believe in the perfection of things, I'll become complacent and I won't strive for anything. But she says instead, perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. That should be as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfect, look perfect, and act perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. It's a shield, it's a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from flight. So we'll keep that up. So, some of you already know there was a time in my life that I couldn't bear to speak up in a room of 10 people, you know. And back then it was because I had such a strong sense of perfectionism that if I didn't say something smart or right, there would be such a flood of shame that would come as a result of that I just didn't raise my hand. Even if I was getting the highest grade in the class. You know, this perfectionism around the standard of being. I remember there was a time when I hated my body so much that I would wake up in the morning and get up and look at the mirror. And I think I was probably 5 to 10 pounds lighter than I am now. I would look in the mirror and I would go back to bed because I was so depressed that I didn't fit this ideal of what I thought a perfect body, perfect figure would look like. There was a time when I wouldn't try out for anything in school because of the fear of falling short and failing. There was a time when I thought that I was always right. There's an ongoing joke I have that I was right for the first 30 years of my life, or so I thought. And then I encountered the Enneagram, and I understood that as a type 1, the idea that you were wrong meant something so fatal to like who I was as an identity and as a person, that I couldn't be wrong. Because to be wrong would be to destroy even who I am and my own worth. And so it's been through the process of uncovering the gifts of the Enneagram that all of these various pieces have shifted. And I want to say that it's a process of shifting for each person in their Enneagram type. If you have just a little bit of perfectionism, or if you're a type 1 on the Enneagram, or if what you're dealing with now is living with a type 1 on the Enneagram, that we can bring great compassion to the understanding that if you're particularly blind to this piece of reality, then when you look at yourself, and when you look at other people, there's going to be an orientation, a blind spot, a tendency to not see what's right, but to instead see what's wrong in order to fix it, in order to perfect it. And so how does awareness of this help? Again, if you're not a type 1, but you know people who are like this can help you to have this compassion, to not take it personally when you're being criticized by someone who's highly critical and perfectionistic and seemingly controlling and trying to tell you what to do. Because what drives that is a profound suffering within the individual as to the loss of connection of this vital piece and understanding of life in a way that, yes, we all have, but in a way that feels more personal and profound. And if you are a type 1, or you have a wing in type 1, or you're a type 7 who goes to type 1 under stress, then you might be aware in yourself of how in the moment when I'm most likely to beat myself up, that's no longer going to be a reason I'm going to beat myself up more because I'm supposed to be spiritual, and why am I beating myself up? And I'm supposed to be better than that. So instead of beating yourself up more, that is an amazing opportunity to consider that perhaps I have lost sight of this one face of reality. That if I turn within instead of to the outside world, and if I engage this practice of claiming the truth of the innate perfection in myself, in all life, that what arises in me is a profound serenity and peace. And that in that moment, I can know this facet of truth that I have so painfully suffered from having lost sight of. So in any moment of judgment, in the Bible, there's this saying, judge not lest you be judged. The way Unity interprets this passage is not that there's some God on high judging us, but that we actually do experience directly, like karma, the effects of our own judgment in the moment. So this is why the practice of not judging others can be so vital, because as we judge others, so do we judge ourselves. As we judge incompetency in someone else, so are we that hard on ourselves. We use the same measure. And so there is a freeing process that happens when we're willing to not look to fix, perfect, or correct, and instead settle into the present moment. So that leads me to my final point for today, which is how do we really come home to ourselves? By coming home to the awareness of this is one face of God. We're going to journey through all 9 faces, but the idea is that as we realize this truth, then something kind of mystical happens to our collective as well as individual experience. Something shifts, a greater knowing of who we are in truth rather than our identification with this ego self. I know for me, there's absolutely no way that I could be standing before a group of people and speaking had I not encountered the Enneagram and understood, this fallacy around brokenness and the need to fix myself. I would not be able to, in my relationships, ever apologize for being wrong. How do we come to a place where we can do that? How do we support each other in coming to a place where we can admit fault, admit relative imperfection? What the Enneagram teaches is we do it by knowing true, holy perfection. As we center in the knowing of our perfection and wholeness, then you know what? Oops, we can make blunders and it will not cost us our identity. And when this happens, other people can make blunders. And we're not going to act like the punitive God out there to punish them for making mistakes. But the greater impact that this work can have is, in our everyday lives. I guess I'll share, I wasn't sure if I was going to share this, a little bit fresh, but somewhat recently, I had someone in the Unity movement who's really high up there. So this person's, elevated in the movement. So naturally, for me, I'm going to have a higher expectation of this person, right? So this person was arguing with me about a certain matter, both factually and otherwise. I was a philosophy major in undergrad. I see logic in my head. Like some musicians can hear music in a certain way, and when someone's illogical, it's like nails on a chalkboard for me. That's how it feels, and I'm like, no, I can't, and so here we were, this person who I had sort of higher than usual expectations. And I won't explain exactly what it was, but it was almost like what he was saying was 2 + 2 = 5. And imagine my reaction. I almost cried, because here's this person saying, Nhien, 2 + 2 = 5. And I'm like, it equals 4. 2 apples and 2 oranges equals 4 pieces of fruit. He's like, well, but you ate one of the oranges yesterday. I'm like, well, that's not the point. It was that kind of argument. But that's not the point. 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, well, but what if you gave away one of the oranges? I'm like, oh. So there was this irrationality that happened. I can tell you, the old me would have just died. Would have just been, I give up. Life is over. I had this extreme of, if you're not rational, I can't live, And I did that for a couple hours. I'm like, I can't believe this, because this person's decision on this matter, which is totally illogical, is actually impacting also my life. It's not an abstract argument we're having. What he's saying will impact some of my decisions in my life. And so I'm in a lot of pain about this. And I hear myself going, he shouldn't be like this. Oh, I'm shitting on him, right? Right? That's the moment where we could recognize when we have a should, we're doing exactly that. We're doing this evaluative, we think we know better than life. I was arguing with life, and the famous modern mystic Byron Katie says, if you argue with life, you know who's going to win, right? So the idea is that we cannot argue with what is. There's a deep acceptance of what is. And I'll talk about the future in a second, but the deep acceptance, but so long as I was in the stance of this should not be, he should not do this cannot be, I should move now, I should leave, I should, have all these ideas. Thank God for Eckhart Tolle. So Eckhart Tolle, the Enneagram, Unity, all helped to bring me back to this, that the present moment has no story in it, right? The present moment just is. And so when we honor that, when we resist what is, we can't enter the moment. we cannot come into the power of the present moment. And so we think by resisting what is, we can change it. But we're the least powerful when we haven't even embraced the truth of it in the first place. And so as I took this moment, I listened to some YouTube Eckhart Tolle, got myself back. And then he said something about the audacity that is really related to the Enneagram Type 1, but it's true of all of us, that we think we know. How do I know what should be? How do I know that even him being wrong about his math there isn't right for my life? How do I know that? That's all it took to budge. And then it's like the wall of should fell away. And in that moment, I had one of the most profound moments of peace that I've probably ever had in my life. This peace. And from this peace, I had more joy. And from this joy, you can bet that my future responses to this individual were a little bit more skillful than they might have been had I not entered into that moment of peace. So even on a practical matter, there's something about our willingness to accept what is, embrace the perfection of what is, and allow that, entrust that to move us into the future. Instead, what we do is we future trip. Oh, this can't be, I gotta fix. But instead, when we enter into the moment, something shifts into the future space naturally for us. We are more grounded, more able, coming from a whole place. And then the truth of it is this, too. In the end, what do I really want? Am I so worried about this issue that it's not going to get me what I want in my life, what I want in my job? Or am I concerned about waking up? To remember that I am most interested in waking up. Waking up out of the illusion of separateness, through the embracing of this divine idea of holy perfection. So that my embrace means that I, like Jesus in the cartoon earlier, am able to look at life and see it for what it truly is and say, that's not a tail, that's not a stool, that's an elephant. As I become awake, I'm able to operate in reality in a much more skillful, vibrant, but mostly peace-filled way. And is that not ultimately what I'm seeking anyway? But to start there in the first instance. So I'm going to end with a poem by Shel Silverstein. Some of you might recognize this. This is the poem for the Type 1. It's called Almost Perfect. Almost perfect, but not quite. Those were the words of Mary Hume at her 7th birthday party, looking round the ribboned room. This tablecloth is pink, not white. Almost perfect, but not quite. Almost perfect, but not quite. Those were the words of grown-up Mary, talking about her handsome beau. The one she wasn't gonna marry squeezes me a bit too tight. Almost perfect, but not quite. Almost perfect, but not quite. Those were the words of Miss Hume, teaching in the 7th grade, grading papers in the gloom, laid up at night in her room. They never crossed their T's just right. Almost perfect, but not quite. 98, the day she died, complaining about the spotless floor. People shook their heads and sighed. Guess that she'll like heaven more. Up went her soul on feathered wings. Out the door, up out of sight, another voice from heaven came. Almost perfect, but not quite. And so this poem shares the suffering of the one, but the suffering that we all experience when we are constantly comparing and gauging reality as if we knew, as if we had all the facts and knew what objective reality should be like. But if instead we set aside that rating system, if only for a week, and thought that every time we tried to say, as if we know what should be, that instead we came into the present moment, right here, embracing everything and everyone, including yourself, especially yourself, as you are, and allowing the natural peace and serenity that comes from that to flow, then what would your week be like? Can you do this with gentleness? Look upon the world with gentler eyes and know the perfection and holiness of yourself, of your neighbor, of your boss, of your partner, of your job situation, your finances, of the political state even. And allow that knowing to inspire your next action.